I dropped out of Reed because I couldn't write a word, and I was just overwhelmed. I mean, the first person I met at Reed was a girl whose father was, well, I think he was head of the Harvard Medical School or something. And I'd gone to a very ordinary blue-collar high school. And within a matter of a few days, I knew I wasn't going to cut it at Reed. And so I met a girl, and we stayed drunk for 5 weeks. And I was living in her room in the women's dorm. So I think we were the last two ever expelled for something called intervisitation. A wonderful world. So I was, I was the first one in my family to go to college. And particularly on my mother's part, I was persona non grata back in my hometown. So,
in Fontana?
No, I was born in Fontana, but I basically grew up where my parents had migrated to from Ohio during the Depression in eastern San Diego County, actually a tiny little unincorporated place called Bostonia. But anyway, before I was being kicked out, I had been active for 2 years in high school in the Congress of Racial Equality in San Diego. I have Black relatives by marriage. And I, of course, joined CORE in Portland the minute I got there. And one of the people in CORE is now the labor historian, Jeremy Brecker. And as I was being expelled, he said, well, you know, and he was the only STS member, I think, in the whole Pacific Northwest at this point. And he said, well, you know, they need bodies in New York City. So being unwelcome at home, I took what little money I had left and I boarded a Greyhound bus wearing a pair of huaraches, a Mexican sandal, and arrived in New York in, I think, the beginning of November, in one of the coldest winters in the 20th century. And I worked in the national office until the end of March. STS was then in the midst of this transformation from being this little group of students attached to a social democratic organization called the League for Industrial Democracy to becoming an independent, autonomous student organization that started to grow with the speed of light. Most people in national office were working on the first march on Washington against Vietnam, which occurred, I think, that April. But my assignment was to help organize a demonstration at Chase Manhattan Bank in 1961, was it? Or was it 63? 63, I guess. At any event, Chase Manhattan had led a consortium of international banks that had bailed out South Africa after the Sharpeville massacre. And we wanted to have an anti-apartheid demonstration, the one that focused on American complicity in apartheid. So Chase Manhattan was the target. And I was, of course, totally lost, inexperienced. We didn't have enough money, but we paid $25 a week in New York, which was not enough to pay rent and live on. So I couldn't even take the tube. I had to, I had to walk most places back and forth. So I saw a lot of New York. But there was a Friends of SNCC chapter in New York City that joined us and worked with us. And it was headed by a woman named Elizabeth Sutherland. Years later, I'm in the Bay Area, and there's a meeting in which the legendary Chicana activist, Betita Martinez, is speaking. So I go to the meeting, and she jumps down and says, "Hey, you're that little kid from New York." And I said, "Elizabeth, Betita now," she said. And it was a terrific group of people. And we also worked with South African students. So we had a sit-in at the bank. And we had real-time information on the bank's, the inside reaction, because it turned out amongst the New England SDS chapters were 3 members who were sons or daughters of the board at Chase Manhattan Bank, plus David Rockefeller's daughter, Abby, who was a key fundraiser and contributed to SDS, the anti-war movement, SNCC. Anyway, after that was over, I was sent to Berkeley and Oakland. SDS at this point had something called the Economic Research and Action Project. And the strategy was to build an interracial movement of the poor in northern cities to be a kind of second front for SNCC in the South. And this was a very serious, absolutely committed attempt to we'll put it this way. I wrote a letter to Herbert Marcuse because Jeremy Brecker told me he was the smartest man around, and if I wanted to know Marxism, I should write to him. So I sent him a letter just telling all the great things we were doing, including our community projects. And Marcuse wrote back saying, I'm sure you're a great bunch of kids, but why are you doing the war on poverty's work for it? This is what the government should be doing. I think you should be doing something that's a little more oppositional. Anyway, these projects really didn't go anywhere, but I was sent to Oakland to see if we could open a community project in African-American West Oakland. And it was a bit of a fiasco. I talked a girlfriend and other friends of mine into quitting everything to work on it, but I soon discovered it wasn't going anywhere. So SGS sent me to Los Angeles, again with the idea we were going to march into the Black community and be helpful. So at this point, we were building a freeway through Pasadena, through the Fair Oaks community. This is a historic African-American community. This existed since the 1880s, and it's where Jackie Robinson's mom lived. And so I went over and met with her. And she's just an incredible, noble woman. And she kind of patted me on the knee and said, I think it would be better for you to go organize some white kids against racism. This community can take care of itself. So I ended up moving about a half mile from the USC campus, which was the only SJS chapter in Southern California, headed by a remarkable woman named Margaret Thorpe. And she was the daughter of a railroad worker from Arcadia, California, in the San Gabriel Valley. And we managed to raise money, and with Women's Strike for Peace was our benefactor throughout this period, headed by a wonderful woman we talk a lot about in the book called Mary Clark, who turns out to be the aunt of the writer Rebecca Solnit. But anyway, Mary took me under her wing. We got enough money, and we rented this, what would once have been a stables, to one of the great estates just north of SC, and that became this ramshackle STS office. But again, I had no idea what we were doing. And so I met a guy who has always been a major figure in my life. I always thought of him kind of my big brother, named Levi Kingston. Levi grew up in the Pueblo del Rio projects. I think he's Trinidadian in his ancestry. And after high school, he went to sea for a couple of years. And this had enormous influence because he's around all these radical sailors in an integrated group. I don't think Levi had seen a white person apart from a cop or a social worker the whole period he grew up in South Central. And then he'd come back and in 1960, 61, ran a coffee house near LACC called Pogo's Swamp, like in the cartoon. And the coffee house was the mecca for a group of radical students at LACC, including a guy named Ron Everett, who later changed his name to Ron Karenga, and the founder of the US organization, which was the largest Black Power group in following the 1965 rebellion. But anyway, this group of kids, they got together, and it included Franklin Alexander, who became the head of the Che Lumumba Club of the Communist Party, a bunch of other great group of other people, 18 and 19. Some of them became freedom riders later on. But they organized, first of all, protests against the execution of Carl Chessman, the rapist who became a best-selling novelist. And Pat Brown had finally been convinced to pardon him by his son, Jerry, who was a seminarian in San Francisco. But the pardon arrived too late and he was executed. But before that, there'd been a series of protests. Then they went on and they organized protests at Woolworths, because Woolworths, which were the largest five and dine chain in the US, and had lunch counters, and Woolworths were everywhere. Even in the place I grew up, there was a Woolworths. But they were the target of sit-ins by the Southern Student Movement, the group that became SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And so the LACC students started organizing parallel protests at Woolworths. And this group was the kind of major seedling for so much of what developed later on. And it was a strikingly integrated group. And Levi was the, how should I say it? He was the impresario of all this because he ran the coffee house. And he had this extraordinary knack for bringing people together. So when I arrived to work with Margaret Thorpe, Levi showed up. And he's the one, he was kind of my Mephistopheles, I guess it were, who showed me the ropes in LA, took me all around, everywhere from, you know, strange underground beatnik parties in this castle-like mansion in Pasadena that had a dungeon. I'll never forget that. But he also introduced me to so many of the activists in South Central. And Levi and I were together during the August uprising. And because we were near USC, we were walking down the street, pardon me, and somebody took a couple of pot shots at us. And I assumed they were probably shooting at Levi. I assume these are probably, you know, fraternity guys. But most of what I know about LA was originally learned as a kind of an apprentice to one of the city's greatest and absolutely most dedicated organizers. The book is dedicated, my part of it, to Levi, and he died a few weeks before the book appeared. Levi spent his whole life from his return from the Merchant Marine organizing in South Central. And in the very last months of his life, he was in a nursing facility. He was organizing the people, the residents in the nursing facility, writing off letters to city officials protesting the awful conditions there. He did not die of coronavirus, but talking to him in the last few months of his life, he was saying, these are just become mortuaries if there were ever an epidemic. He saw all that coming. at the beginning of trying to organize. My job, I had two assignments from STS as the first regional organizer. The first was to raise money, which for the, for STS. And I was total failure at that. I met all these wealthy Hollywood leftists, and I just...
Can you name names?
Well, I won't name the ones I was appalled by. Some of them really quite horrible. But the most interesting was Irene Schindler. Irene's husband had been one of Europe's early modernist architects and came to LA after the Austrian Civil War in 1934 that crushed. Vienna was a red city in the 20s, governed by the Socialist Party, and had amazing advanced social housing. And this is the milieu that Schindler and also Richard Neutra, LA's two most famous European exile architects, came from. And Schindler was dead, but Irene was still the kind of grand dame, and played a very important role in financing and supporting the birth of anti-war protests in Los Angeles. And she still lived in the Schindler House, which is now a museum owned by, I think the Austrian government owns it now. But it had been designed to be shared with other couples, including the Neutras at one point. And it had this internal arrangement, which you won't find described in most architectural histories, so that couples could exchange with each other bed partners when they felt the need. It was way avant-garde in advance of anything that the beatniks or the hippies later did. There was also a guy named Lou Marvin. Is that his name, Marvin? Yeah, I may be mistaken here. He was the heir to the S&H green stamp fortune. And in those days, I mean, I can't tell you how many hours I spent in my house helping my mother piece green stamps into albums. You got these savings stamps when you shop for groceries and other stuff, and you pasted them in the books. When you got enough, you could exchange them for goods. Anyway, he was the heir to it. He was a very strange figure. And he had this, he bought this estate called Moonfire Mountain above the Palisades, I think. He had a legendary bed on there was like a tower that had a bed on the top of it. But he threw these wild parties that are legendary, part of the whole lore of Hollywood in this period. So Levi and I and a wonderful young woman from Pasadena, from Pacific Palisades High School, where there was this really great student group that worked with SNCC and other civil rights groups. And half the kids in it, fathers worked for the RAND Corporation, game theorizing nuclear warfare in Santa Monica. But anyway, she went with us. And so we spent a whole night with this guy, trying to chat him up, trying to get a donation for the anti-war movement. And then he turned to us with tears coming down his cheeks and said, "Oh, I love you guys. Everybody else comes here and wants my money." So, so I was a big failure at that. But my other task was to go around organizing SPS chapters. And within a year, Margaret and I, with the help of a young faculty member, UC Irvine had just opened, new UC campus, Patty Lee Parmalee. She was an expert on Bertolt Brecht, and she started an STS chapter. So the three of us went around organizing and speaking And all of a sudden, STS groups started sprouting up everywhere. This is after the March on Washington in April 1964, 65 had drawn attention to STS. And so amongst other things, I was once smuggled through a window, okay? Literally a rope was lowered down and I climbed up into a window to a secret meeting at Laverne College, in Laverne, California, at the end of the San Gabriel Valley. This is a religious school. And any kind of new left group would have been immediate expulsion. I worked organizing a chapter at Santa Ana City College, junior college, and you needed 5 members to become an STS chapter. So these 5 kids got together and we chartered them as an official STS chapter. And the head of the school called them in and he said, "You're to disband this immediately, or 1, I'll expel you, 2, I'll have you arrested, and 3, I'll have you drafted." They went ahead and he did exactly what he threatened to do. Oh, and this is one of a 1,000 stories you could tell about how courageous people were in this period. And it also exemplifies what is one of the main themes of our book, which is the real social force behind Black liberation, behind the anti-war movement in Southern California, were, first of all, high school kids, including junior high school kids. And secondly, the militant campuses were community colleges or a couple of state colleges, Valley State, which is now Cal State Northridge, and Cal State LA, but particularly in the junior colleges, we had some fabulous groups. We also, at this period, because apart from Women's Strike for Peace, we had no financial support at all. The way STS supported its regional organizers, when I was sent out to Berkeley, Oakland, for instance, is they shipped me out 2 huge cartons of STS publications by Greyhound. And then I set up a card table in Sproul Plaza and sold STS literature. I managed to rent a house, a rundown house without power, electricity in Oakland, and recruit 3 people to live there with me. So STS had no money, but there was the pioneering reality in-your-face talk show in Los Angeles. It was called the Joe Pine Show. And I forget, it may have been Channel 9 on television. Joe Pine was this partially handicapped World War II veteran. He was the angriest of men and a total reactionary. But the whole design of the show was keep him at a fever pitch for the entirety of the program, and then bring on people he hated so that he could denounce them. And there's a guy named Louis Lomax, who was a local Black writer and journalist who became a regular on the show. And right after the Watts Rebellion, on one particularly notorious episode of the show, Joe Pine pulled out a gun and said, "They're not coming into my neighborhood." And then Louis Lomax pulls out a gun on TV, live TV, and says, "Well, you're not coming in my neighborhood, Joe." And this was all staged. But to keep the atmosphere as hysterical as possible, they would invite young Americans to freedom, and then they would invite STSers, and we were paid to go on the show. So we just get volunteers from newly recruited STS kids, and we sent them on the show to have these confrontations with young Americans for freedom. At the same time, Margaret and I were appearing regularly on a program called 9 on the Line, where we debated Young Americans for Freedom. I was also once on the first Melvin Bell. I was the most famous defense lawyer in San Francisco. He was an institution. He was a flamboyant guy with this office that looked like it's set for Oscar Wilde or something. And they put him on TV to run a talk show. And I got invited on the first show. And Kirk Douglas was on it. Now, Kirk Douglas later came out against the war in Vietnam very honorably, but at this time, he was actually going around the world for USAID, defending the Johnson administration in Southeast Asia. And I was on first, and he was on. And then afterwards, I'm leaving the studio, and he comes up to me, and he pokes me in the chest and said, "Listen, kid." And he's shorter than I am, which I expected to be like 8 feet tall. He said, "Listen, kid, you're just a commie dupe," or something like that. And I was breathless. I didn't know what to say, except that I loved his role in this anti-war film that he'd made with, I think, Stanley Kubrick, called Paths of Glory. Mm-hmm. It's about the trial and execution of some French soldiers who refused to mount a suicidal attack in the First World War. So I just looked at him and said, "Well, Mr. Douglas, why did you make Paths of Glory?" I mean, he was speechless. So we were going on and doing these crazy debates. Now, Margaret had been a national champion debater. So she made up for my speech problems and lack of deductive logic. And I remember once we debated at Pepperdine College, and there were like 500 or 600 people in the audience. And before the debate began, they did a poll. How many of you are opposed to the war in Vietnam? Not a single person in the audience raised their hand. So we debated the Young Americans for Freedom, and some of them ended up then becoming Republican congressmen and major figures in the New Right. But it was a quite heady time, and it was, for me, I was also on dealing with the FBI, because during my brief turn of Berkeley and Oakland, the guy who was helping me set up a community project, the son of an Oakland sheriff named Roy Dahlberg, who went on to become business manager for the mine trip, big burly kid. Last guy in the world you'd think would be a militant SDSer, but he was. And I got a hold of this book by somebody named Henri Alleg, and it was about torture and resistance to the French war in Algeria. And in it, he has a passage where he talks about hundreds of young communist members burning their draft cards somewhere in the south of France as they're being inducted, their conscription documents. So one of us turned to the other and said, "We should do this." And so there was a demonstration, not against Vietnam, but against something totally forgotten today, which was Lyndon Johnson's invasion of the Dominican Republic and his overthrow of the leftists, the democratically elected president of the Dominican Republic, sent the Marines in. It was pretty brutal, but it was later eclipsed, of course, by the war. So a young Berkeley graduate student named Jim Petrus, who later became very, very well known as a solidarity activist with South America, professor, written numerous books. Anyway, he led a small demonstration, so a group of us burned our draft cards. And then a month or two went by, maybe even a little more. Anyway, on the same morning, at the same time, there's a knock on the SDS office, which was also a crash pad for it. It was also a crash pad. I mean, we had all these mattresses and so on, so didn't anybody visiting. who just wanted to hang out could stay by. And Roy, I think, had just started working for the mine crew. But we both got knocks in the morning about 7:30. And as I recall, we compared notes on this once, both of us, there were two Mormon FBI agents with their continental ties and identical suits to inform us that we were being investigated and might be indicted by the Justice Department for burning our draft cards. Well, the law was still a little unclear about this. And this went on for months and months. In the meantime, we're both 1A. I show up at the induction center in downtown Los Angeles, near where the LA's old second newspaper, the Herald Examiner, was located. And it was just mayhem. Everybody was pretending they were sick or ill, or they were all, you know, there's guys crying. It was amazing. But I passed the physical, even though I had mononucleosis at the time and weighed about 120 pounds. They didn't care. So they shepherded us into this room, and you get this like pamphlet or form, and it lists all these subversive organizations, and you have to swear on the bottom that you're not a member of any of them. And some of them are absolutely crazy, like the Hungarian American Folk Song Society and so on. And 80% of them at least are, ethnic organizations associated with the Communist Party. And so this is supposed to take about 5 minutes. And there's a African American Marine sergeant who was handing out these to be signed. And everybody finished mine, and I handed mine to him and said, "I'm not signing this, sir." And he looks at me and he leans over and softly, he says, "Son, there's no shame in being illiterate. I'll help you sign it if you want." I mean, he was a genuinely really nice guy. But I told him, I said, "No, I belong to several of these organizations and I'm not signing." And he said, "No shit?" He said, "Are you kidding me?" He says, "Wait till I tell the lieutenant about that." So all these other guys who were pricking their fingers, put blood in their urine and so on, they all ended up being shipped out. But it cut me loose is temporarily, morally unsuited or something. I forget what the category was. The very same time, Roy's up in Oakland at the induction center there. He turns up the induction center. Again, he's a big burly guy. He's wearing a Mother Hubbard dress, rouge, lipstick. He's taken a bunch of drugs. He comes up before the Army doctor and he says, "I'm a drug-addled homosexual." And according to Roy, the doctor didn't even look up. He just says, "Don't worry, son, the Army can straighten all that out." Next.
Oh, great.
See, we were doing all the wrong things. I was working with the Fellowship of Reconciliation and with the American Friends Service Committee doing draft counseling. And Levi Kingston started coming around to these sessions. And he says, "What's going on?" He said, "You're just getting these middle-class guys out of the service. Some more poor white and poor black guys died in Vietnam." He said, "This stuff," because we were going through just the requirements and the details on how to become conscientious objectors. So he took it in a totally other direction and started something called the Freedom Draft Movement, which was the first of what became a whole national network of Black anti-draft groups that were organized. Because there's no, East Side LA, the south side of LA, Chicano black kids. None of them ever heard of conscientious objection. And he started the first of these. I mean, again, as in so many things, he was really a pioneer, but he was also my conscience. So I started thinking about this. Why indeed is SES spending all this time trying to save white middle class kids at colleges from the draft? Maybe we should go in. Okay. Or maybe we should resist. This was right about the time that the first draft, active draft resistance, was occurring and would later grow into a valuable component of the anti-war movement. And all of us had friends who ended up going, spending time in federal prisons for draft resistance.
Can you talk about what the appeal of SDS was when you were traveling around and organizing, particularly with like high school students? How did they like understand or become attracted to that platform?
Well, in some ways that's never really been explained because so much of the history of SDS and the New Left has been confined to kind of celebrated incidents or notorious incidents at Columbia, University of Wisconsin, or Michigan, or Berkeley, although SDS. I was sent to Berkeley to help organize an SDS chapter. Berkeley really didn't need one. But the truth is, and I wrote about this years ago, it's not actually in the book, it's in something I wrote about much earlier, which was a culture of anti-authoritarianism had grown up, a genuine national, totally unorganized youth rebellion. And in Southern California, 61, it took the form, they had closed down the drag strip in San Diego. And so my friends' older brothers and so on shut down one of the main streets in San Diego and raced up and down the street for an hour. Cops came, people threw bottles, drove the cops away. Finally, the highway patrol came, they had to use tear gas. And it occurred the same week that the Christian anti-communist crusade, which was sponsored by San Diego's only newspapers, the Union Tribune, came to town and was immediately denounced as a communist plot. There were similar hot rod riots all through LA County. There were riots at the beaches. And most important of all, there was an uprising in Griffith Park. Thousands of LA's biggest park, the biggest city park, in fact, in the country. Black kids were there in an area called the merry-go-round area, where the merry-go-round used to be. And cops tried to arrest somebody. I forget for what minor offense, just a misdemeanor. And they started roughing up this kid and other kids. So black kids, and we're talking mainly high school age kids, they started fighting back. And so a bunch of them got arrested and indicted for a felony. Some of them went to prison for it. But this image of defiant black youth standing up against the LAPD, one of whose roles had been under the notorious Chief Parker, William Parker, had been to police the boundaries of the ghetto, to enforce segregation. And part of the reason all these kids were in Griffith Park is that had just recently, black kids had started going there because South Central LA had hardly any parks at all. I mean, where they did have parks, Will Rogers, South Park, and so on. I mean, it's just, small parks, neighborhood parks. And so this was an act of defiance in itself to go to Griffith Park. But anyway, the argument I make is that this was a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, that the two major reactionary newspapers in Southern California and various other figures, including Chief Parker, talked about this as if it were being orchestrated from Beijing or Moscow. But what was underneath this was a rebellion against these kind of fatalistic structures in which working class kids of all colors, including my cohort who lived in East San Diego County, you would be drafted, then you'd end up in a blue collar job if you were white, and your life was all set out. And people were, resisting this. They were resisting authority, the promiscuous authority of the cops, the authority of school vice principals, authority in general. I mean, my first political act was participating I was junior high school. Actually, it was my last year in eighth grade in these drag strip riots in San Diego. And I really didn't have much of a political idea in my head, but we're just carried away by the events. I mean, we just rejected the authority figures and the authoritarianism of blue collar life in America at that point. And so talk about SDS on junior college and small college, state college campuses. The real roots of it lay, first of all, in this youth rebellion of the later 50s, early 60s. And secondly, of course, in the example that was so central to the growth of the New Left, at least in its early years, which was the utter courage and commitment of Black students in the South, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Now, I had joined Congress of Racial Equality in LA in San Diego when I was 16. And I'll never forget the evenings when we'd go down to the Jewish Community Center in San Diego, which had purchased for us something called the Watts line. It's kind of unlimited phone account. And we'd go down there. And this was, say, the summer of 1964, and put on the speaker. And we'd get the latest accounts, firsthand accounts from people in the Neshoba County or people responding after the murder of the 3 civil rights workers in Philadelphia, Mississippi. I mean, it was brought in live time.
Wow.
If I'd been a year older, not a high school student, because I was too young, my dream would have been to go south of the Freedom Rides, like so many people did in Los Angeles. Los Angeles was regarded by CORE, which started the Freedom Rides, and SNCC, which jointly became involved in them. LA was considered one of the chief reservoirs of writers. And so after the early and incredibly ugly violence attacks on Freedom Rides, they turned to LA and they turned to the Bay Area and New York. And I forget, we listed in the book, I think it's about 48 kids from LA, black and white, went south. Some of them had really horrible experiences. One of them was injured for life on a Freedom Ride that got stopped in Houston, Texas. And the black guys on the men's side were treated kind of as, brothers and heroes in the segregated jail. But the poor white guys who were there got beaten very badly. One guy permanently injured on the white side. There were so many stories like that. And then 2 years later, another large batch went for Freedom Summer in Mississippi, and then came back to LA. and became activists. And you can't overemphasize the importance of the Southern experience in seeding the movements in the North, including an almost forgotten event, which is a chapter in the book, which was Los Angeles's United Civil Rights Movement, United Civil Rights Committee of 1963. This was during Birmingham's summer. And the biggest single battle, of course, of the entire civil rights movement was not Selma. It was in Birmingham, Alabama. And this was the scene of some of the most despicable incidents of white violence, including the bombing of the church that Angela Davis had gone to. 4 little girls were killed. But the Birmingham Freedom Movement wasn't just fighting for one single one. They wanted across the board employment, housing, schools. And the support movements in the North, in several cases, became comparable movements. They took the Birmingham template. And in Detroit, you had a really massive movement in 1963, led by a minister activist named, I think his name was Albert Cleage, a forgotten figure. But it shouldn't be forgotten because, there are tens and tens of thousands of people. And the second biggest Northern freedom movement, again, making demands across the entire spectrum, was the United Civil Rights Movement in LA that brought together the Congress of Racial Equality, NAACP, a couple of the young ministers of Black churches who later became central figures in LA politics, like the Reverend Bookmans of one of the historic Black churches. So this is wide unity supported by the United Auto Workers and unions. And the Mexican American Political Association, which was a progressive democratic organization of Latinos in California, also participated in this. And it was a big movement with huge rallies, mass protests, sit-ins. It built off a momentum already created by CORE's campaign to open up suburban housing, which was almost 100% segregated to Black families, a struggle that came to center on protracted battle in the city of Torrance, where hundreds were arrested. The attempt was the United Civil Rights Movement was to put pressure on all 3 major fronts of housing, jobs, and schools, and also to negotiate directly with Los Angeles elites. And there were all these meetings for the big aerospace companies, for major employers. The school board, in a way, was the most reluctant to any kind of negotiation over these questions. Had a conservative majority, and it become a almost totally segregated system. But the movement failed. It failed to win the concessions. It laid a basis for future activity and paid dividends in the form of the election within the next 2.5 years of a number of Black activists, young progressive Black politicians like Tom Bradley, who's an ex-cop, who built this remarkable coalition centered in the Crenshaw area of Japanese Americans, African Americans, and Jews. It was the seed of what became a citywide alliance of liberal whites and the Black community. So it paid dividends, and it helped launch their political careers and win victories, but it was otherwise a defeat that set the stage for the inevitability of the movement being taken to the streets into direct confrontation with the LAPD and exploitative business owners in the Black community.
Could you talk about why, like, your initial efforts trying to integrate Black communities with SDS and recruit them to SDS movements failed? Like, what was the response from those communities?
Well, SDS really did not attempt to recruit Blacks. We were considered itself to be an ally to SNCC. And we saw the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee as being really the vanguard of the struggle in America. And we really did understand our role was to organize anti-racism amongst white campuses and white people. Something was overshadowed, in fact, far too overshadowed by anti-war activity as time went on. This is not to say there weren't African-American members of SDS. There were. A woman named Carolyn Craven, and who came out eventually. I think she started in Cleveland and came out to the Bay Area. A very prominent figure on the Bay Area left was an SDS leader. But basically, we saw our role is one of parallel struggle, and that really was, I think for many of us, it was essential that there was Black leadership, not whites substituting themselves. This is the reason I later joined the Communist Party in Southern California, because its youth wing had Black leadership, multiracial, largely working class. It was, the kind of image of what we wanted the movement to be. But there was never any doubt in the early days of SDS where the real leadership and the real struggles were, or our responsibilities to it. And again, there were also remarkable SNCC people in the North, like Betita Martinez, their chief fundraiser in New York City. In Los Angeles, SNCC's representative was this amazing kid who was 16, had been a freedom rider and beaten up in the South and so on, named Jimmy Garrett. And I'll never forget the first time Jimmy Garrett came in the SDS office. I think it was during the Watts Rebellion. We were in the curfew area. It's very dangerous for people to move around. He came to the SDS office for a meeting, or maybe it was right after it. In any event, I mobilized some mainly white high school students, and Jimmy came, and he was absolutely mesmerizing. And I thought I was about as young as you could be. He's even younger than I am, but he already had 2.5 years worth of battle scars and medals and so on. He would later go to San Francisco State and become one of the pioneers of Black Studies movement. And Friends of SNCC had a setup in Hollywood run by a remarkable young woman named Karen Coonan, who'd been I think at UCLA in the dance school, studying to be a professional dancer. She threw all that in to run this office. And there was at that point, a Friends of SNCC in San Francisco put out this incredible magazine or paper, tabloid called The Movement, which was the main source of news about things like the farm workers movement, all the civil rights struggles, Berkeley. It also reported on the South and on the transition from the civil rights movement to the Black Power movement. And it played an absolutely central role for several years. And both Jimmy and Karen were big influences on me.
can you talk about like the indie papers and the kind of emergence of the DIY media coming out of like subcultural groups?
Well, in the Black community, there were two papers. One was the Eagle, which was an essential part of the Popular Front that was formed in LA in the late 40s between civil rights groups in all communities, the CIO unions and their political wing, and the Communist Party. Communist Party at its height after the Second World War probably had 10,000 members in Los Angeles County, spread all over the place in every community, unions and so on. This is a very powerful Popular Front. And it had an extraordinary figure as its strategist and chief organizer, a woman named Dorothy Healey. And I once had the privilege, after Dorothy's mother died, she lived in South Central for years and years. And I had gotten this illness and didn't have medical coverage. So to qualify for medical coverage, I had to drop out of college for a semester. So I lived in Dorothy's back apartment and helped her arrange her papers for sale to university. So I got to read all her old love letters and her family albums. So here's the daughter of Jewish socialists from Denver, okay, who earliest memories include Big Bill Hayward sleeping in her father's couch. Drops out or is kicked out of high school at 16 because she's on a soapbox in Oakland, haranguing me unemployed. Goes on to become a heroic organizer of food processing workers, packing house workers in the Salinas Valley and elsewhere. Later becomes, under the brief 4-year period when California has a Democratic New Deal governor, Governor Colbert Olson, just before the beginning of and during the early part of the Second World War. She becomes the state labor commissioner and inspector. She's a tiny woman. Dorothy's 5'2". Her mother was 4'11". Dorothy's 5'2". But certainly the most powerful mind I have ever encountered. We fought like cats and dogs for years and years, but she remains the major kind of moral and intellectual influence in my life. And writing my part of this book, my half of this book, was a constant argument with Dorothy. Dorothy's never died for me. She lives on, giving me a hard time in my mind, forcing me to rethink a lot of the positions that she attacked me for having back in the 60s, ultra-leftist, infantile leftist, positions. And again, in one of Jon's fine chapters, talks about KPFK. And Dorothy's whole project was to preserve and then expand on what remained of the Popular Front of the 40s. And this included relationships with left liberals who were not fellow travelers or party members, but involved in the progressive campaign. It included some of the UCLA intellectuals. Although Paul Schrade at the UAW had been an adamant anti-communist because he was a protege of Walter Reuther, the anti-communist leader of the UAW. He was soon seduced by Dorothy and became friends. Everybody spent as much time as they could in her living room while she smoked these horrible little black cigarillos, living off TV dinners. And I lived with her. That was my assignment. Go buy us 12 TV dinners, Mike. but she was, she was the kind of the major mind of the, of the period. Everybody went to her for advice. The Panthers went to her. Some Democrats who probably still don't want to be named used to meet with her secretly. They wanted political wisdom. They wanted to know what to do. So LA's dissident district Communist Party, and I joined it at the same time Angela Davis did, and for similar reasons, because the district had opposed the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. It had supported the communist reformers in Czechoslovakia. And at that time, I believed that the possibility really existed of a kind of communist reformation and rebirth. But also, as I mentioned earlier, because the party had this small but stellar group of young people, the most outstanding of which were some of the Black members. Franklin Alexander, his brother Deacon. Franklin then married a local civil rights activist, Kendra Alexandra. Just amazing group of people. And Dorothy gave them a totally free lash. I'm sorry, Dorothy gave them a totally free lease. She loved to quote Lenin as saying, "Youth must come to socialism on its own accord." You couldn't tell young radicals how to behave. You could argue with them, you could berate them, you could critique them, but you had to accept their experience, their sense and understanding and novelty of historical situations, their reading of the landscape of struggle. So Che Lumumba was totally autonomous in that sense, made all of its own decisions, which constantly got Dorothy in hot water with the old Stalinists in New York City, who wanted to crack down on it. Also the fact that Dorothy encouraged party youth to become active and with SDS. She didn't see SDS as a competitor. She saw it as another part of a generational radicalization that was important to applaud and support. At the same time, she had a critical relationship. She had a critical relationship to everybody. I can't, this high school dropout was just the most trenchant thinker I've ever seen. I devoted years to trying to win an argument with Dorothy and never succeeded.
How did you come to run the communist bookstore, and what was it like? Who frequented it?
Well, the Communist Party in the 40s had bookstores all over the country. One of the survivors was something called the Progressive Bookstore at 7th and Union, just west of downtown, a block and a half from the FBI headquarters. And these were the days when Bunker Hill redevelopment was forcing thousands of old, sick people out of downtown. And they spilled over in the MacArthur Park District. And I was given basically a party stipend by running the bookstore with an older woman who was the bookkeeper. And I quickly discovered how the Soviet Union financed communist parties around the world. Volumes of the collected works of Lenin, okay, which sold for, I forget, they were only like $3.50 or something. We paid 11 cents for them. But the bookstore became something of a nightmare, particularly for the people in the Communist Party who had opposed Dorothy's leadership all along, the kind of hardliners, party liners, Russophiles. Because I just sorted every left-wing book under the sun, you know. Trotsky, Bukharin, Social Democrats, Mao Zedong, because I wanted to appeal to young radicals, so they would have available, books from all sides. And I was, I don't know, 4 or 5 months into the job, and the FBI used to come by, poke their noses through the door, and usually not say anything. Sometimes they'd just smile. They'd just look around to remind us they were just up the street and watching us. But one day this guy comes in, and I'm with my best friend, a guy named Ron Schneck, who just gotten out of the Navy, working class Jewish guy, went to high school in Dorothy High School in the Crenshaw area. Same high school he later taught at for years and years. And we're kind of little wild men in this period. We have like rifles hidden in the basement. By the way, what's stored in the basement of the Communist Party bookstore? Endless volumes of Stalin's major work on the history of Bolshevik organizations in the Transcaucasus. No one, believe me, no one ever read that the Communist Party was ordered copies in the late 30s, because that's all there was in the basement. Next to that, and our two guns, which nobody but other young communists knew about. So this guy comes in, and he dressed just like an FBI guy. He looks kind of like an FBI guy, and he starts taking notes. He spends like a half hour in the store. He's taking notes on everything. So I turned around and I said, let's wrestle this guy out of here. So we threw him out of the store. I mean, we physically pushed him out. Later that night, I get a call from Dorothy, and she said, well, you've always wanted to be a working class hero. Now you can go out and get a job and become one. And I said, what? You're fired. I said, what did I do? She says, I've been contacted by Gus Hall, and Gus Hall, the chairman of the Communist Party, has heard from the Soviet embassy that their cultural attaché has been attacked by young Trotskyists or Maoists in the party's bookstore.
Oh my God.
So that was my first brief career in publishing. I've had several since.
Can you talk about the Sunset Strip riots?
About the one?
Sunset Strip. What was your perception of the diggers?
I have none.
You have none? Okay.
There were diggers in LA. I didn't know about. Again, I have to apologize because
You don't have to apologize.
although an activist in this period, in my 20s, early 20s, I was never a member of the counterculture.
Yeah.
I'm a kind of beer drinking Irishman with short hair.
What did you feel about the hippie revolution, and did you have an opinion on it, or think it was stupid or interesting, or?
No, I mean, I was up there on this Sunset Strip, and I saw these kids the same way I saw my own contemporaries back in 1960, who were fighting for the right to assemblage. Remember that the Bill of Rights does not protect teenagers. At least that's been the interpretation in courts. And in this period, one of the big issues was fighting for the application of adult rights to teenagers in terms of freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. As far as the counterculture went, well, I was kind of in my own red counterculture. In this period, I was also working. I mean, I went through this fantastic training program that the War on Poverty and the Teamsters Union set up to train people from low-income or disadvantaged backgrounds to be heavy-duty truck drivers. So my life became totally oriented around building an insurgency in the Teamsters Union and then a big Teamster Wildcat strike in 1970. And
Sorry,
part
did you,
of the year excuse me?
did you carry produce, or what goods did you?
I started off with concrete.
With
with-
concrete?
Yeah, with ready mix. But I got so enthralled watching the iron workers building the Arco oil palms downtown that I spilled a load of concrete in the middle of the street. So I went on. I worked for the largest distributor of toys
Oh, wow.
in the country. And it was a wild job because in December I would work 16-hour days. I still have one of my paychecks, $300, which is a hell of a lot of money for 80 hours work. But at the beginning of the year, everybody but 2 drivers would be laid off. There were 14 of us.
Wow.
So I could use the first 2 or 3 months here until I was called back to work.
Right.
I would like to say for political activity that I spend most of my time hiking in the San Gabriel Mountains,
Nice.
which I love the San Gabriel, for virtually every inch of them, including the wilderness areas. But I mean, my life is kind of focused on rank and file labor in that period until I came back to school, started UCLA as a freshman when I was 29. I was almost 30 when I went back to school. And then I'd work part-time as a truck driver, during school vacations.
Just in California or across country?
This crazy job driving Grand Line buses because, the tour buses in Southern California. And because I had been, married, I considered myself a fully grown man. I did not want to live like a student.
Yeah.
I wanted to change it. So I'd heard that Gray Line was hiring. And me and another guy both had class 1 licenses, driven for big distributors. Decided to go on the Gray Line. You worked for him full time for like 6 months. And then you go on something called the extra board, which meant I could work 5 nights a week. And with tips that you got from the tourists. I was looking forward to, living the life of Riley at college, because I thought college at this point had just become an incredible luxury. It's totally different from when I was 18.
Yeah.
But so I worked there for about 4 or 5 months. Then all of a sudden we're on strike. And the guys at the place decide to hire mobsters to kill the scabs. Now, I'm already off the picket line because I'm accused of assaulting a scab, who claimed that he was a prisoner of the Viet Cong. Who knows? But supposedly I broke a picket sign on his face. And so I was invited by the chief business agent to sit in his office on Union Street and watch TV during the day, but I wasn't allowed to picket. And this strike went totally to hell. Very lucky that this whole group of guys ended up going to prison because they actually hired a hitman. But the guy was drunk and pulled over by the highway patrol with a bunch of shotguns in his car. I mean, the thing you discover about working people in this country is simple matters of organization. Okay, the experience of decades of unionization get completely lost if they're not preserved and conveyed in some way. But when a consumer worker, black or white, sees somebody sitting in his truck or taking their job, people go berserk. And their first inclination is to shoot. I closed down Century Plaza Hotel during the strike with another. We were picketing there on the hotels the airline picks up for.
Right.
I said, half the drivers coming in deliveries, the taxi drivers, they're all Teamsters. Let's shut it down. We sat down in the entrance to Century Plaza, shut it down. And the union went berserk over it. On the other hand, the same group of guys pulling guns out of closets and stuff at the spectacle. I mean, American working class is not usually very organized in its reaction, but it is extremely militant in that sense. Thing that very few histories capture is the grassroots of all this. Black and Chicano high school and junior high school kids, veterans, militant Teamsters, the first big teacher strikes in 1970. Activism was in literally every corner.